It is 10 a.m. We wanted to first wish everyone a happy new year. Hope you had a safe and nice New Year's. We're just very excited for OSHR and the OSHR Events Committee to host this great opportunity for us to go visit the Everglades safely from our home. I wanted to give an opportunity for I wanted to give a shout out to the events committee for putting this together under the direction of Ann Lewin. And then Mr. Reeves, if you wanted to unmute yourself and share a little bit about what we should expect today. And we want to thank you for putting this together and getting us in contact in that sense. So Mr. Reeves, you have the floor. Is Al Reeves on? Ann?
He's here, Daniel, but I guess he might not be at his computer.
Okay, that's not a problem. So the agenda for today is to turn it over to the ranger who is out there in the Everglades and is going to give us a tour of the Everglades. So with that being said.
Michael, this is Al Reeves. Can I give a little welcome from the events committee that I had trouble unmuting before?
Sure, feel free.
Okay. Hello, Ollie members and Ollie travelers. Welcome from the events committee. We have had our hands tied for the last year, but thought that perhaps rather than traveling out, we could bring a destination to you. I know if you're anything like me, my feet have been itchy to go, and the Everglades are one place that I've always wanted to visit. So I enjoyed this video. I hope you did. And now at 11 o'clock, we're going to have a online visit with a ranger, Chris Beers, who is going to be in the field in the Everglades and give us a experience. So stay tuned, and I'm sure that that's going to be worthwhile and enjoyable. So once again, welcome from the events committee, and hopefully maybe we can have more events like this. And once the pandemic is gone, we'll start traveling again. Thank you.
Wonderful. Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Michael. Very much appreciate being here. Wow. So we have a lot of people with us today. That is awesome. So I want to introduce myself. My name is Ranger Denise, and I work at Everglades National Park. I've been working here for about the last 5-6 years, interning and working. And it's been just some of the greatest times I could honestly say I've had in my professional life. This is an incredible place, and I'm very excited to share it with you. First of all, I do want to just kind of emphasize, I know looking around me, I'm not in the Everglades, even though I have this cool Everglades decor. But we will actually have a ranger live in the field, and I actually see the ranger now. Hi, Ranger Chris.
Hello. Can you hear me okay?
Absolutely, we can. Thank you so
right.
much. So before we go over to Ranger Chris live in the field, I just kind of want to get us used to the Everglades and in general, the National Park Service. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my PowerPoint, and hopefully you guys can see it okay. I'm going to give it a few seconds. So right now on your screens, you should be seeing our arrowhead. This is our logo for the National Park Service. As you can probably tell from the way we talk, we are incredibly proud of our mascot. This is everything that represents what we do and why we do what we do. If you notice, there's a couple features on it that are very particular, and those are very important as to what they represent. The bison in particular represents wildlife, even though we don't have bison everywhere, including Everglades. If we had our own arrowhead, it would be with an alligator. But the bison represents wildlife that we protect. The tall sequoia tree there, again, another tree that we don't have here, but it represents the plant life that we protect. The mountain, that tall mountain peak with that beautiful snowy top, that represents lands, public lands that we protect for future generations. And of course, that tiny little pond there on the right side, you may see poking out there. That represents water, lakes, rivers, canals, even parts of the ocean that we protect. And the shape of the arrowhead is also very important. A lot of you, when you think arrowhead, when you look at this, Native Americans may come to mind, and that's the goal, because that represents the history, the culture, the stories that we tell from long, long ago. So when we talk Everglades in particular, it's kind of a mishmash. There are so many national park sites. In fact, there are over 423, I believe the last count was. So it's kind of a crazy map that we have going on, which is what you're looking at here. However, if you actually go to the bottom right corner, kind of showing you where that little manatee is that says Biscayne National Park, well, that's our sister park. We're right next to Biscayne. But as you can see on this map, there are so many other national park sites. A couple of you may have been to many of them. Hopefully you have. And if you've ever been to Everglades, I hope this is a refresher for that energy to get you back into national parks. And if you haven't been before, I truly hope that it inspires you to come and visit one day. So this is kind of a bird's eye view. If you were to fly in a helicopter and just look down over South Florida, this left picture is what you would see, the Florida Peninsula. Now it's a really cool landscape, and I love saying that, but when we say that, sometimes it makes people think like there's gonna be mountains and there's gonna be immense, incredible features. Well, not really so much in Everglades. I'm biased. I would say that it's definitely super interesting, but in order to really appreciate the Everglades, you really have to get down at a ground level and look at the little features. One of the biggest features is this right map. This kind of shows the water that flows through South Florida. Now, I don't want to give too much away because I know Ranger Chris is going to give us a pretty good preview on why water is so important in the Everglades, but I just want you to know that South Florida is actually on a slant. So the water that begins up in this area called the Kissimmee River Basin flows down to Lake Okeechobee, and Lake Okeechobee is kind of like a heart. So it like pumps, the water flows down to the Everglades, which is where we are. So that's going to be pretty important on us getting that water. And Ranger Chris will tell us a little bit more about that. But now we're going to go even closer. So there's the map we were looking at on the left, showing where the water goes. But on the right side, this is actually the map of Everglades National Park. Everything within that green line that you see is Everglades National Park. And it's just about over 1.5 million acres. This is the third largest park in the continental US, excluding Alaska, because they've got some really big parks. But this is a massive, massive ecosystem. And the different colors, I wouldn't say to focus too heavily on this map because it can get pretty complicated. But what I would recommend to do is take a look at the colors, because these colors are going to be indicators for different habitats that we have within the Everglades. So for every color that you see, you're going to be seeing different plants and different animals. And that's just one of my absolute favorite things about this. Now, when I say habitats, this is what I'm talking about, what you see on your screen. Notice how it gradually goes higher and lower in some portions. This white chalky stuff, I won't give it away. It's pretty important, and it actually is what defines our habitats. So you might notice that some of them are higher and drier, and some of them are lower and wetter. Where we're going to be starting now with Ranger Chris is an area that we like to call our sawgrass prairie. The sawgrass prairie you can actually see here in this screen. Hopefully you can see my cursor. If you can't, it's one of the lower and wetter habitats. Now, I don't want to give anything away, and I think I'm ready to spotlight Ranger Chris. So Ranger Chris, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to go ahead and spotlight you so we can hear what you have to say.
All right, good afternoon or good morning, depending upon where you are. My name is Chris Beers. I'm a park ranger here at Everglades National Park, and this is a real delight to be able to be beamed into dozens or hundreds of different living rooms or kitchens or classrooms. I know it's been kind of a weird year. I don't think I need to tell anybody that. But this is a wonderful blessing that we have this opportunity. And I'd like to thank the university and Miss Lewin for reaching out, Mr. Trainer for getting all of this set up. So here I am, Everglades National Park. And I know that you just watched a pretty good in-depth video that sort of focused on lots of different aspects of the Everglades and maybe some of the challenges that it faces. And we might go over some of that again, but we're going to go over it because of its importance and because we're really going to try to emphasize the little subtle nuances that I think make the Everglades a really spectacular place. We're going to try to do an awful lot. This is super ambitious. We're going to try to visit at least 3.5 different habitats. And we've started at this one in particular. This is the Sawgrass Prairie or Marl Prairie or freshwater marsh. I'm not a scientist or hydrologist, so I don't get too uptight on any of those names. I use them interchangeably. But if you sort of look around me, and maybe if the camera pans out, you're going to see quintessential Everglades. This is the habitat that people think of when they think of Everglades National Park, when they think about that river of grass. And it's dominated by sawgrass and other vegetations. And we'll talk about sawgrass in just a second. But this really helps to encapsulate what makes the Everglades so unique. Yes, South Florida is very, very flat, but it's those small changes, minuscule changes in elevation mean huge changes in the landscapes of South Florida. And we're really going to try to highlight those and then maybe talk about how we've seen some impacts of that throughout the at least past 100 years. So, you know, when I first started working at the Everglades, I was like, alligators, talk about pythons. And what I've really started, the more I learn about it, the more excited I get about limestone. Now, I know that they mentioned limestone in the video that you watched, but I'm just going to hold up some of it right here because it does such a good job at illustrating some of the things that we're going to be talking about. So the first one is, you might notice that it is a white chalky calcium carbonate, for those chemistry inclined. It's porous, and this is the building block of all of South Florida. When the South Florida Peninsula was created geologically, it had to do with the ocean levels rising and falling over the past 100,000 years or so. At times, this was a shallow sea. At times where I'm standing was maybe a dry savanna. And during those natural fluctuations in glaciation and water levels, you had the water rising and falling, and limestone gradually became deposited in a couple of different ways. The first off is through animals, animal like a sponge, and it has a calcium carbonate shell. It was underwater, and when the water levels retreated, the animal portions died away and the exoskeletons remained. And when this was not necessarily underwater and it wasn't dry land, maybe this was a beach area, a lot of limestone was deposited oolitically through these tiny little positively charged ions. Think about sand sort of washing on the shore. And when the water levels gradually receded to the levels where they're at now, the rain, the acidity in the rain actually helped diffuse that calcium carbonate and made that floor what it is today. And that's incredibly important. It's incredibly important in terms of how we South Floridians drink our water, but it's also important in terms of the degree in which that limestone slopes down. The highest points of the Everglades are about maybe 8 or 9 feet in some places, and it moves all the way down to the sea level. And the one thing that I think is really interesting, if you just sort of pictured all of this, the Everglades is not a very old habitat. It's only about 5,000 years. So geologically, that's an afterthought. There were people living in South Florida before there was an Everglades. So the Everglades has evolved with humans as a part of it. So if you think about this completely blank slate, it's going to be subject to hydrological forces and biological forces. And even though you think of it as being a flat surface, animals and plants exploit and exaggerate and amplify those tiny changes in elevation. We're going to see the result of some of that today. So what we've got right now is we're standing in a transverse glade. And basically, it's a river. The water's moving very, very slowly. And this area's got a hydro period, or the amount of time that the water's traveled, and going to be on the surface of the ground right now. So if you look at my feet are underwater. please don't tell my supervisor that I'm not wearing park approved boots, okay? This hydro period, or the amount of time that water is on this landscape, really determines the type of plant species that are able to live here. You don't see any really tall trees because it's going to be wet for about 6 to 8 months of the year. In South Florida, we have 2 seasons, the wet season and the dry season. And we get most of our rain during the wet season, obviously. We get about 6 feet of water that falls between about May to November. And in those pictures that you're looking at, you can see a pretty dramatically changed landscape. I think that speaks to how different these habitats can look based on what time that you're living here. And also, how do those plants and animals respond to those different changes? So the Everglades in itself, this is I'm standing in a marl prairie, and what you're looking at is a really interesting effect on the water levels and how it corresponds to living things that need water. So you might notice some different colored discs. They're sort of spread out and are able to explore the different habitats, and how during the dry season they become really concentrated in those areas where you have water remaining. And in the saltwater, in the sawgrass prairie, what you have is a oligotrophic or poor nutrient system. You think about the Everglades and the rich soils, the calcium carbonate backbone that it has doesn't really promote a lot of growth. All of the vegetation and soil needs to be built up from it. So the soil that we have in the sawgrass prairie, I mentioned it's also called a marl prairie. So take a look at the soil type that defines this area I'm saying. It's called marl. It's very sort of thick, sticks together. It's just really finely ground down calcium carbonate water and some plant material, not a lot of oxygen there, not a lot of nutrients. So in order to survive here, you need an animal or plants, at least, that are able to survive a low nutrient habitat that's going to be submerged for 6 to 8 months out of the year. This is the plant that does that most profoundly in the Everglades. This is sawgrass. I just plucked up a little bit of it. You can admire it. We call it sawgrass, a little bit incorrectly named. It's not a grass. It's a type of plant called a sedge, but we don't call it saw sedge because if we did field trips, we'd never get the kids to stop laughing if we called it by its correct name. But we call it a saw because of the saw-like blades. And maybe you're able to see it behind me. And those saw-like edges that line either side of the plant, you might think that they're there for protection, maybe to disincentivize animals from eating it. And maybe that's true. And maybe you're able to look at those saw-like blades. Those can actually cut you. But that's only half the story. If you were to look at the bottom of the plant, you'll see where the roots were into the ground. You know, it's smooth. There's nothing here. Animal like white-tailed deer, they'll come up, they'll pluck up, and they'll actually eat the base of the plant. And you can eat it too. It tastes like wet celery. If you're a group of 4th graders, I say it tasted like deer pee, but it doesn't. Just wet celery. But the reason that it has those sharp edges sort of speaks to the magnificence of how adapted the Everglades are to this particular habitat. So we experienced 2 seasons out here, the wet season and the dry season. The sawgrass is doing just fine right now. There's plenty of water for its roots that can go into the limestone, get those nutrients. But during the dry season, during times of drought, it can go months without raining. So those saw-like blades actually help to capture condensation on those tiny little tips, those tiny little blades. And then maybe you're actually just able to see some pictures of that condensation that forms out here. It's super common when it's super humid in these days. And those tiny little drops of water actually slide down the center of the plant and water it. So this is a plant that would do very well in my backyard because I would always forget to water my plants, but it's very capable of surviving in a habitat that sees those wild degrees of fluctuation between being completely flooded and being completely dried. So in just a few minutes, I mentioned we're going to be seeing an awful lot. This is unprecedented and totally awesome. I'm excited about it. But we're going to be leaving this habitat. But what I'd like for you to notice is that most of the plants dominated by one or two types of species, sawgrass and maybe other mealy grasses. That soil, that marl, not particularly conducive for good plant growth. Not a lot of canopy out here, and it's going to be lower and wetter. So this is just a small piece of the greater Everglades ecosystem. We're going to understand how all of these pieces tie together, and then maybe how they've been affected over time. But in order to do that, we're going to need to hike down just a couple of minutes, and hopefully the next time you see me, you're going to notice a tremendous change in just about every observable adjective or detail that you can see out here. So Ranger Denise, why don't you tell us what the Everglades actually is and how it has been going for about 5,000 years, then we'll check in at a completely different spot.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ranger Chris. So I did want to just share those pictures that Ranger Chris was mentioning, the dramatic changes in this landscape, to just kind of give you that view. So this is pretty much peak wet season that you're looking at right here. And we went to an area that is pretty similar. I'm not sure it's the exact same area in the dry season and the peak dry season to show you that difference. So this is the wet season. Here it is in the dry season. You can notice the radical changes. And this is absolutely, I think, one of the most fascinating parts of the Everglades is that it is a landscape of ever-changing features and drastic ever-changing features. It's not just one side to the other. It is extremely wet or extremely dry. Now, what Ranger Chris was mentioning, and I'll pull up that slide here, is the overall Everglades ecosystem. It's kind of hard to explain to visitors why just that little part of South Florida that we have as Everglades National Park is technically not just that's not the only Everglades. So that's the portion of the Everglades that we have preserved, the 1.5 million acres. However, it is significantly larger than that. In fact, it starts up here. You may have seen this map before, but up in the Kissimmee River. Now remember, South Florida is on a slant, so that water does flow down south to Lake Okeechobee, down to the River of Grass. But something that is very important for us to understand is that the water, once it gets to the Everglades, we're the last receivers of it. So you have to also keep in mind the human impacts that we do tend to see and that we struggle to maintain and figure out a solution. Down here south of Lake Okeechobee, it's very common that we have sugarcane farms. And of course, sugarcane farms, they require lots of nutrients to produce that sugarcane, including phosphorus and nitrogen. Two very strong factors that can really impact our water in a negative way. Those two elements, the phosphorus and nitrogen, can actually produce more algae in the water, which essentially lowers the oxygen and kills off a lot of plants and animals. So that is something that we do see, but you know, in essence, I would say the Everglades is a really amazing place that you can see some beautiful habitats. But again, it all feeds off of this water. If the water is right, the Everglades is going to do great. And again, these habitats that Ranger Chris is saying, we can find them all throughout what we call the greater Everglades ecosystem. And again, that's the area from Kissimmee River all the way down to Florida Bay. Now, Ranger Chris was mentioning that the age of the Everglades is pretty important. Everglades, the greater Everglades ecosystem, let's say, is only about 5,000 years old, relatively young compared to other areas within the world. This area before it rose above sea level was below the sea level, which is why in that calcium carbonate, in that limestone, we actually tend to see ocean fossils. We tend to see shells. I mean, I've even seen like little fish that people found in there, like the little skeleton. It's incredible what's preserved in that limestone that tells a story of what happened long before the Everglades was above the sea. Now that it's above the sea, it's our job to figure out how to maintain this water going in a good way, right? So we look at South Florida, we look at this map, and really all I see is water. But one thing that's very important to remember is that there's people that live on the eastern side of Florida and also the western, but I'm thinking Miami, those big, big cities. And those people don't like to have water in their houses. I often joke with kids and I say, you know, what if we just set the water to your house and just let the Everglades take over? And they're always like, no, don't take our homes, right? So we're not going to do that. So something that's really important in Everglades National Park management is figuring out how to keep the Everglades healthy and happy, but also maintain human life, right? So we want to protect people's homes and cities. We want to make sure that everybody is getting what they need, which can be very hard. So this is kind of showing you that example of the past, the historic flow. And historic is very important there because we're going to talk a little bit more about how we actually changed that flow. Some areas in South Florida were actually homes for people way back when, during those early 5,000 years ago. We actually had Native Americans that utilized specific habitats for their homes. And it looks like Ranger Chris is actually in that habitat, which is known as the hardwood hammock. So this is, as you can see from this map here, it's high on that limestone ridge, so it's nice and dry, but I won't give too much away. Ranger Chris, we'll go right to you.
Okay, well, hello. I really didn't walk very far. That didn't take very long, but I'd invite you to sort of cast your eyes about. Maybe the camera can highlight. We are in a completely different habitat. The sun is still the same. We are at the same latitude level. We're not coming on a different day. The only thing that has changed in terms of anything inorganically, anything that wasn't alive, the only thing that changed is we went up about that much in elevation. We're about 2 feet higher than we were in the sawgrass prairie. And that 2 feet meant everything. We are now in one of the highest habitats. This is the hardwood hammock. So let's compare and contrast. Already you're going to notice a bunch of different types of wooded vegetation. If I was to go down and take a look, oh, this is good. And maybe can the camera even see me bouncing on this? The soil that's accumulated here, oh, is so rich. Oh, that smells so good. Take a look at that awesome, really rich soil, good nutrients, good detritus right there. All right. These trees are able to grow nice and tall. Those broadleaf trees also produce a pretty amazing canopy if the camera goes up. This is one of the few places in the Everglades where you're able to go and get a good bit of shade. Some people say they call it a hardwood hammock because a hammock is a nice place where you'd want to tie a hammock between 2 trees. I've also heard that it is comes from a Miccosukee word, which means a cool, shady place. But nevertheless, the fact that we're here and we're dry speaks to about 2 feet in elevation. So one thing that I've noticed when you look at the map of the Everglades, you talk about that freshwater body of water, and you'll see these tree islands. You know, when you I know that they mentioned them in the movie, those teardrop shaped tree islands. And when those plant communities were established, whether it was 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, they simply exploited some of those naturally higher places in elevation. So you have these small tree islands that are growing on this lone outpost. As the water continues to flow north to south, it flows around it, it stays dry. During the dry season, those trees, those small shrubby trees, they dig their roots into the ground and they start to drink water. And the water that they're drinking has tiny little crystals of calcium carbonate in it, tiny little bits of that limestone. So as those roots soak up the water, they take the water that they need and they actually excrete those tiny little bits of calcium carbonate. That plant now has this very thin veneer of that rocky limestone on top of its roots. And maybe over the span of a couple of years, it doesn't grow more than maybe 1/8 of an inch, but that tree will die, another one will grow. Capillary action sucks that water out, they secrete the limestone. So the trees in these hardwood hammocks, actually, there's a positive feedback. The fact that they're here means that they're continually building themselves with inorganic calcium carbonate, which is amazing. And it helps to promote that type of ecosystem. And this is one that people found favorable because it was dry for most of the time. It's characterized by that nice, rich, peaty soil. The sun doesn't necessarily burn everything. Those tall trees act as a windshield, so we don't get a lot of loss of the nutrient or the soil through wind or evaporation or other means. So this is a much more humid and cooler place, and that's really important because that distinguishes it almost entirely from another habitat that we're going to visit in just a second. So the hardwood hammock is a wonderful place. I'd encourage you to come and check it out. You can feel you feel like you're maybe in another universe, and I would invite you to look over at this particular specimen over here. We have an example of nature hard at work. We were Ranger Jeff, the great and powerful Ranger Jeff, who is the videographer, and I were saying, well, where should we stop? And so this is really pretty cool. This is a strangler fig tree. It's in the ficus family. It's parasitic in that what it does is it produces fruits. Bird eats the fruits. Bird poofs out the fruits. Those fruits land on a host tree and it begins to grow. And you can actually watch it expanding and strangles out the host tree that it lives on. This is, I don't know how to say it other than this is a really cool tree right here. And what you're also able to see is that you're watching another one of those processes, those chemical processes is happening at the bottom. This is right here is what we call a solution hole. So that limestone, that geology just doesn't necessarily stop because we're in a hardwood hammock. When you have a lot of the leaf litter that does lay here, it when it rains, as we see it right here, that rain interacts with some of the dead and decomposing detritus. It creates tannic acid or carbonic acid, but actually eats away at that limestone, causing these little deposits, these little mini oases of water that can be found during the dry season, which is incredibly important for protecting a lot of other smaller animal species that aren't maybe able to find the fresh water through some of those wetter habitats during the dry season. And this is, if I could bottle a smell and send it to you, this area just smells humid. There's a tremendous amount of just earthy awesomeness, and that's a scientific word, a scientific way of putting it. But we've got so many different places to go. I could talk about the hardwood hammock. So before I go, I do want to mention, we talked about how animals, or at least the plants of the sawgrass prairie, were perfectly well adapted for life in their habitat. The hardwood hammock is a home to numerous endangered species, such as the Florida panther. It's also home to the black bear, but it's also home to these. And this is an endangered animal. This is called a ligulous tree snail. This is not a live one. I'm gonna hold one up to you. We call this the jewels of the Everglades because of their very beautiful pattern. Please ignore my nails. I know they're dirty. I'll get a manicure and pedicure later today. Don't worry about me. All right. But because humans find them so beautiful that we almost love them to death. So this is a snail, lives inside of here, conical, and it actually will affix itself to these trees. So it's very common in terms of being able to find them. Ligulous tree snails like to eat lichen, that mixture of algae and symbiotic mixture of algae and fungus, which grows on lots of different surfaces, grows on the plants here. This is a park that was established because of its biodiversity. The Everglades is special because of the living things that are here. And just to underscore that, there are 500 different species of lichen that are in Everglades National Park, and they're finding new ones to science. So a lot of lichen here. These snails are lichen that. They can walk, they go around, they feed, and then during the dry season, when it's a little bit less humid, they want to be able to protect themselves. These snails will estivate, stick themselves and fix themselves to the tree branches. When humans in the past 100, 150 years moved into the hammocks of South Florida, they really began to prize these snails because of their beautiful patterns. And what's interesting about these snails is that each snail takes on a particular pattern or color based on the hammock that it's living in. So if you talk about these separate tree islands that are separated by the moat of that moving body of water, you almost have these different universes, these different cosmos, these snails that are developing in silos, developing their own patterns. So when people wanted to collect rare specimens, they would collect the snails from a particular habitat, they would collect all of them, and they would burn that hammock down, thus preserving that unique fingerprint, shell for their own so that they could have the most prized collection. So the Everglades, we've already talked about it, pretty dynamic. We've seen the lower freshwater part. We're at one of the higher parts right now. We're going to go to another one that is also subject to great changes on various forces, as we'll see in a second. But to understand maybe the impact that us humans are making a little bit more on the natural flow of the Everglades, I'll send it back to Ranger Denise. And when I come back, you're going to see a very different habitat.
All right. Thank you so much, Ranger Chris. Oh my gosh. There's so much information and it's so hard to limit and pick just the best information for you. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. I'm seeing the questions come in. For the bigger questions, I'm going to save them for Ranger Chris at the end. Thank you so much for using the chat. However, I do want to mention a few things about human impacts in the Everglades. So I briefly mentioned that flow of water and the nitrogen and phosphorus that we tend to see, but there's other impacts that you may actually be familiar with. The first one is these birds. I don't know if anybody has any idea how people really limited the amount of birds that we had in the Everglades, and this was in about the 1920s. So in the 1920s, it became very fashionable to have birds on your head. And I'm not just saying feathers. I mean, if you look at the actual close-up of these photos, you can see entire taxidermied birds on top of these ladies' hats. And this was the trend, this was the style. And in order to get these birds, we had illegal plume hunters come into Everglades National Park and start killing off these birds. Now, this was a really terrible thing. And at this point, I think it's important to mention that it wasn't Everglades National Park yet. It became a national park in 1947, and this wasn't about the 20s, but it was still just not good to just go and just kill off all these animals. And people realized that very quickly, as this site was not very common again until we reestablished this as a national park and made it illegal to actually capture, kill any birds. So, I mean, these feathers were beautiful and you can definitely look up more photos about it. But there's a lot of other ways that we impacted the Everglades. So on the left side of your map, you're looking at a satellite photo of what we believe. So this is kind of like a manufactured satellite photo of what we believe South Florida looked like in about the 1850s. So you're seeing Lake Okeechobee, you're seeing all that blue, that's all water flowing down to the lower tip of Florida, the Florida Bay area. Now, if you look on the right side, you'll probably immediately notice those huge just blotches of gray and red. And you can probably surmise what they are. That red right underneath Lake Okeechobee is farmland. And all that gray on the eastern side of Florida is development. So we impacted this in a pretty significant way in that, like I mentioned before, we don't want to have flooded homes. So in order for us to make the 1850s livable, we needed to do something, and you can probably guess what that was. We needed to build canals. We needed to dredge out these canals that would divert water away from South Florida and from the Everglades. By doing that, now these areas that were seasonally flooded aren't flooded anymore because the water goes right into the canal. And from this map here, if you look on the right side, you can see that the water goes out to the ocean for the most part. There's a little bit of water that goes out through these canals, but the big canals go out to the ocean. So that water is still pumping, still flowing through Lake Okeechobee, but it's not quite reaching the Everglades. Of course, as you can guess, that is and was a really big problem. And we realized that when we started seeing habitats start to change. Without that flow of fresh water, they really started to morph into different kinds of habitats. And a lot of the animals that we were seeing suddenly became endangered or just not around. So this is a machine that was used to dredge canals a long time ago in South Florida. And we still see these canals today. This is still something that we battle. And I think that it's something we will continue to battle throughout the years. Because like I said, we can't make people leave, you know, and we can't just build over the Everglades. We have to figure out a balance. So human impacts are a really big part of this. You can see a couple of these pictures here, farmlands. You can see all these canals crisscrossing, and this is just one picture of South Florida. And again, like I said, this the nitrogen, the phosphorus from farms is flowing into the Everglades and changing the water and actually encouraging the growth of different plants that shouldn't normally be there. So I want to introduce our next habitat here. This is going to be the pine rockland, just a few feet below the hardwood hammock, but still higher and drier. But do you notice those changes from the last hardwood hammock that we were in? Ranger Chris, they're all yours.
All right. Okay. So again, hopefully you're able to already notice some pretty stark changes. I'd invite you and the camera to sort of look around. You'll notice that the tree composition is a lot different. We're seeing this is a habitat that's dominated mostly by low shrubs, thin wooded plants, maybe a couple of palms tossed in here or there. This is the pine rocklands because of the rocky ground. Maybe you're able to look down, you'll notice some of that exposed limestone. And one thing that you're not going to notice is you're not going to notice that really thick layer of that nutrient rich soil. You might have a little bit of soil, but most of the stuff on the ground is going to be pine needles. One of the reasons there's a lot more wind coming through here that moves a lot of the nutrients away, and the sun bakes it. And if you look all the way up, you're going to see the very tips of those Florida slash pine trees. You notice that there's not a lot of canopy to speak of, so very different, almost completely the opposite of the hardwood hammock that we were just in. This is a habitat that is defined by its elevation. We talked about water and a change in elevation. The habitat where I am right now is at the same elevation as the habitat where I just was in the hardwood hammock. So right now we're at the same elevation levels. So what's the key determinant in making this a different habitat? Well, if something did not happen here, if something didn't happen for about 20 or 30 years, what we would see is succession of plants start to grow. You'd have some of these lower trees that are broadleaf trees. They'll start to grow, they'll creep up. Those leaves are widen, they're going to widen. They're going to start to shade out a lot of these herbaceous plants, a lot of these grasses. As those broadleaf trees continue to grow, they'll start to dominate, create a canopy. You're going to see a lot of these plants die off now that there's shade. The relative humidity is a little bit higher. There's a little bit of a wall that's protecting wind from coming in. You'll start to develop soils. Those soils in a positive feedback loop begin to cause those broadleaf trees to grow even taller. So if you were to come here, if something did not happen here, in about 30 years, this habitat would turn into a hardwood hammock, that dense, moist, earthy smelling, jungle looking place. And that key thing is fire. This is a fire dependent ecosystem, a fire dependent habitat. It needs fire to survive. And this is one of those places where I was, full honesty, I was a tad underwhelmed the first time I came and saw the pine rocklands because I didn't appreciate it or know enough about it for what it was. But this is a place that needs to burn to be able to survive. And this is a place that actually has more plant biodiversity than any other habitat in the Everglades. So this is a habitat that needs to be able to respond and change to fires. Fires have happened here naturally for hundreds of years. Lightning during those storms, they cause an ignition. The wind spreads it. But the plants and some of the animals that live here are well adapted to fire. This habitat gets its name because of the Florida slash pine tree. This is endemic to South Florida. It's found here and nowhere else on planet Earth. And you might notice that it's got peely, flaky bark. And you notice that its needles were perched up really high. Those are all fire adaptations. Fires happen here every 2 to 7 years. This peely bark operates as a method of defense for fire. So I'm going to hold up. This was an area that burned in 2016, April 2016. So all the growth that you see behind me has shot up in the past less than 4 years. And you notice the outside layer of these plants, they burn and they flake away. They have layer upon layer of peely, flaky bark. This is a response. It knows that it's going to get burned. It wants to be able to burn. The outer layer gets charred, it flakes off, and there's another layer underneath it. Many other layers protecting the heart of the tree. Its leaves are perched up really high to avoid those flames. Most of these plants, if a fire comes by, it's going to actually turn them to ash. That ash actually acts as an incredible nutrient pulse for the soil. It returns all of those nutrients. So one of the most productive times for this habitat is about maybe a week or two after a fire has come by. Many of these plants also have fire adaptations, and they have their root systems deep tucked inside of that, inside of the limestone, so that the second a fire comes by, it gets a rush of nutrients in the form of ash from a lot of those dead grasses. They're able to sprout up, and it's one of the truly magical things. It looks like a lunar landscape. It looks like Mars, and you come back 2 or 3 days later, it has some of the most verdant, lush green vegetation popping up out of the ash, like a phoenix rising from the ashes. And that's really important for a lot of the herbivores. They depend on that really nutrient-rich foliage after a fire, so it helps to benefit the animals too. This is a habitat that's unique to South Florida. There are animals that depend on the biodiversity of plant species here. And again, they're not necessarily going to have the most resplendent flowers or prized like an orchid, but there are animals that depend on some of these plants. They're the host plants for 2 endangered caterpillars, at least 3 endangered caterpillars. The Bartram's hairspreak, the Florida leafwing, and the Atala butterfly. Some of them live here and nowhere else on planet Earth, nowhere else in the universe, which is wild. And if you've ever been to Miami, this is what Miami used to look like. This is one of those higher elevations. 98% of this habitat is gone. The Everglades protects most of what's left. So this habitat, in order to protect it, we actually have a pretty well constructed fire management regime in which we purposefully and knowledgeably set fires so that we can give the amount of fire that this habitat needs in the form of a prescribed or controlled burn so that we can continue to promote its biodiversity. So there's not a lot of this habitat left. We've made a tremendous amount of changes to the overall hydrologic flow. We suppressed fire for a very, very long time. Although humans have been around for as long as there's been an Everglades. The indigenous peoples that lived here, even before the Tequesta and the Calusa Indians, and they would use fire to manage this landscape as well. So fire and humans' use of fire has always been a part of the Everglades story. And that was a story that as a management agency, we weren't necessarily telling or doing. But the Everglades National Park is one of the first places that actually used prescribed fire as a management tool on federal lands in the 1940s. And for our generations on generations that were taught fire suppression and fire is bad, I'm really proud to work at a place that was one of the first to pioneer the use of fire as a land management tool. There's one other habitat we have to go to. This is, again, really ambitious, so we're going to have to go really quickly. But we're going to go to the final ecosystem or habitat, and hopefully you'll be able to appreciate the subtle nuances of what makes this place so special. So Ranger Denise, I'll send it back to you to talk about what Everglades National Park is doing to help the health of the Everglades, and then we'll get a little wet and dirty with the last place that we're going to visit. So I'll be back with you in just 1 minute.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks, Ranger Chris. So I see questions piling in the chat. That makes me so excited. So I'll try my best to answer them. And I know Ranger Chris will be super excited too as well. But we don't like to leave you on the whole idea of people have impacted the Everglades, like that's it, and just leave you there. We want to tell you what we're doing about it. So we recognize the problem. We recognize that there is a problem. Now, what do we want to do? So this map here is indicating the plan that we have. And I love telling this to kids because they always look at me like with stars in their eyes after I say the whole thing. This is the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan. A lot of big words in there. Basically means that we are trying to get more fresh water into South Florida. Because as we said, this is here showing you the map of South Florida. By the word Biscayne Bay to the left of that, that's about like Miami Homestead area. So what we did was, well, if you look at the left map, that's the historic flow. That's what it used to be. If you look in the middle, that's what it's doing right now. We have dredged so many canals that the water is going away from us, and we love that, but it's also going away from the Everglades. So what we're seeing is a lot less water going to our Everglades. And again, this Florida Bay area down here on the southern part is actually really important to mention because we depend on that fresh water pulse to come from South Florida and from that water. Now, our plan that we have, of course, like I said, we can't tell people, get out of Florida, we don't want you here, because we do want them here. This is economy. This is important to have a home here. However, we do want to help the Everglades. So our plan, the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, is a multi-billion-dollar plan. Last I heard, I think it was a 20-year plan. We need to extend that a few decades. But it is a massive plan to actually lift roads, lift blockages that are basically damming the water and preventing it from flowing. We're doing it in a careful way to still prevent that water from going to that human development. But it's a really huge plan. We're already seeing it on Tamiami Trail, which is kind of hard to describe here on this map. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but it's between the Gulf of Mexico and Biscayne Bay on the map, a little bit north of that. But removing those dams, essentially, those roads, and lifting them is allowing this habitat to change back to a really incredible way. And we're already seeing impacts of that. Endangered animals like the snail kite, we're starting to see more of them. So they are a promising sign that we're doing something right, but our work is far, far from over. Ranger Chris, I want to throw it right back to you because I'm super excited about this habitat that you're going to show us.
Okay, so we talked about the changes in the Everglades. I mean, small changes in elevation and water levels mean huge changes in the sort of plant communities and then the animals that are able to respond to that. This is my favorite habitat or plant community, and it is floating in the water here. It's not the beautiful picturesque lake that I have behind me, but this is where it all starts. This is the bottom of the Everglades food chain. This there's probably more biomass, more weight of this than there is in everything else. If you took all the alligators and charismatic megafauna and added together, there'd be far more of this. This is called periphyton. Peri meaning around, phyton meaning plant. This is a collection of different types of algae, cyanobacteria, and it grows in and around the plants and limestone of South Florida. This is the bottom of the Everglades food chain. This is what makes it move, and this is its own little universe. For those of you that have a inclination for Star Wars, you know, if you were able to, this is like a mush, but if you were to look at it really closely, it's like looking at the surface of the Death Star. There's hundreds of thousands of these diatoms, and this is a home, an important refuge for lots of smaller organisms, not the ones that the visitors come to see, but the ones that get eaten by the things that get eaten by the things that get eaten by the alligators. And periphyton is the base that holds it all together. Not only is it really, really cool to hold, it's really good to smell. If you believe enough in it, you can smell it through the camera. That's a promise. It smells really good. And this is a type of algae that, again, thrives in a low nutrient area. When water comes into the park that has been traveling through farm fields, traveling through various types of human and urban areas, it brings a lot of excess nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, which actually helps to over-promote different types of algae and different types of plants. Periphyton is an indicator species. It tells our park scientists and biologists, like the ones that you watched in the movie. Those in the movie, those are like the real scientists too. They're like they're in a different building close to where I work. But periphyton is the building block that holds it all. And just like the Everglades is not going to scream at you like the Grand Canyon or the Rocky Mountains or some of our other national parks, it's a park that whispers to you. And maybe about a month ago, I came out to the Everglades and I was by myself and I was looking out at the sawgrass prairie, and just underneath it, a couple of inches of water, there was periphyton. And I just sat and I looked at it for maybe 10 minutes and all of the organisms started to come out. And I had this earth-shattering realization that the Everglades was everywhere. Every single inch of the Everglades is covered by something that's alive. And whether or not it's magnificent or we put paraphyton on t-shirts, it's incredibly important because it's connected to everything else and connected to us as people. Does a wonderful job at storing water that's hugely helpful during the dry season. I've talked about so much, and I could sit here and squish this all day. Now, I know that this was ambitious of us to try to cram so much in, and if we over tread some of the stuff you wanted to, we talked about that was redundant, I apologize, but it's because we think this place is so very important. This place is important because it, in fact, is a public land that belongs to the American people. I've heard that there's a whole bunch of questions in the chat. We'll do our best to try to get to all of them because there was 6 or 7 habitats we didn't even visit. I didn't talk about invasive species, but I'm more than happy to sit and, or stand, as it were, and answer any questions that you might have. So Mr. Trainer or Denise, I don't know the best way to do that. I know that you're going to read them and we'll try our best to answer those.
Absolutely. So, Mr. Trainer, I'm more than happy to take it over unless you tell me otherwise. Is that okay? Okay, awesome. Thank you. So Ranger Chris, there are so many questions in the chat and I've been trying to like answer them as much as I can. So let's see. One of our first questions was, do alligators and crocodiles compete for territory and food? And do they pose a risk or danger to kayakers?
What a really good question. I didn't even talk about megafauna, but alligators and crocodiles typically do not compete for territory because alligators are a freshwater species where crocodiles are primarily a saltwater species. We do have instances of alligators being able to tolerate salt water for a little bit of time, but they don't want to hang out there very long. And there are times when crocodiles can come into freshwater areas. Whether or not we've seen any direct competition, and I would suspect that would be for, I don't think that would happen. I don't believe that's been observed because most of the time when alligators are competing with each other, it's going to be for mating territory. So I suspect there wouldn't be a lot of overlap over there. The most dangerous thing that you're going to encounter as a kayaker is going to be another kayaker. Alligators are very, very good at alligators. They've got ancient wisdom. They've been around for tens of millions of years. For the most part, they're going to see a kayaker and not perceive, they're going to see this giant thing in the water, maybe with this other paddle. They're not going to be a threat. They're not going to try to knock your kayak over, but it would be a good idea to always make sure that you give them a good amount of space because you're not going to necessarily want to encounter a cranky one. I know that in the video that you watched, I think that there was a kayaker taking a picture of an alligator. The alligators in the Everglades that are dangerous are ones that have been fed by people and ones that have learned to lose their natural fear of humans. If you're giving an alligator a safe amount of space, they're not going to necessarily want to come up to you. So if you give it the appropriate amount of space, an alligator is going to leave you alone. That's a good question.
Awesome.
That was a multiple part question. I hope I got all of it.
I think you did.
Okay.
So there's, oh my gosh, there's so many questions. What is being done to counter the drought periods due to both climate change and human encroachment?
There's not drought conditions and flood conditions. We sort of are understanding a long range, what we can predict. More of what we're able to manage, and we being humanity, not we being the National Park Service, is we try to manage the amount of water in the areas where we still can do that. And most notably, that's going to be in the area around Lake Okeechobee, or it's going to be in the 1,400 miles of canals that take that water from central and southern Florida and then redistribute it to other areas. One of the things that we are affected by when we have droughts is, and I'm not even sure if we were able to get to that discussion today, is the water that's underneath our feet that's percolated through the limestone, that vast reservoir that we call the Biscayne Aquifer. What we're observing now is that we're taking a lot of water for human use out of the aquifer so that there's less water in the water table beneath our feet. That's what South Floridians drink. That's what I drink. That's what I am made out of. So we can try as best we can to limit the amount of water that we use, because that water underneath our feet acts as a preventive buffer against the salt water that surrounds South Florida's peninsula that wants to try to infiltrate that limestone. If we do need rain, I guess I might try to do a rain dance. And if there's a flood, I know that they move a lot of that water around really quickly. If we do get a lot of, it's easier to deal with too much water. Not that the solutions are good, but maybe a couple of years ago, you might have heard about these algal blooms that were happening, not in Everglades National Park, but on either coast of Florida. And when we get a tremendous amount of water, we're not able to store that water. And the system that manages the water that flows even before it comes into the Everglades goes through these water conservation or treatment areas where it just sits dormant. We let plants grow and takes that phosphorus out. But if we get too much water, they release it from Lake Okeechobee in pulses, and it's got so much phosphorus and so much fertilizer. It promotes these algal blooms that make national news because of their smell and the effect that it has on the wildlife. So the best thing that we can do is there are land management agencies such as the Army Corps of Engineers and the South Florida Water Management District that make management decisions upon where they decide to redistribute water for the benefit of the entire system. So that was a long answer for a good question. I hope I was able to get to it.
So Ranger Chris, I have a feeling that a lot of people have heard like scary things about Everglades in regards to snakes. So are there just like snakes all around your feet right now? Is it safe to walk around there? And what about that? Oh man, it's like a bad word to rangers. The P word, those
P word.
pythons.
The P word, once you talk pythons, that's all. In my traditional audiences, we actually, right before this, Ranger Jeff had a group of adorable first graders. And if we started talking about pythons, we would talk about pythons all day. And I don't like to admit this, not a snake guy, all right? Not a big fan of snakes. I have superior survival instincts. But the snakes that are here, I've grown to appreciate them for what they are. We have, I think, 27 different species of snakes, 4 species of venomous snake. They are around and they are present. If you could spend a whole day in the Everglades and you wouldn't necessarily be able to see any of them. When the water level gets really high and there's not a lot of dry ground, it's maybe a little bit easier to find them because the snakes are going to want to bask and stay on that dry ground. Now, in terms of pythons, that is an animal that certainly captures the imagination. They are an invasive species that was released either accidentally or they escaped. They're here to stay. And in my entire time here, I've only seen one python, and I saw it crossing the road. And why did the python cross the road? To eat native species. So to be honest with you, that we could do a whole other discussion on the effect of pythons and that it's had, particularly on the role of small mammals, the type of science that we're doing in order to be able to track snakes with implanted masking pheromones to radio collars. We're only now starting to really understand the impact that they're having on the greater Everglades food web, and hopefully we're able to talk about how all of these different creatures are interconnected through this incredible biodiverse habitat. So yes, there are snakes. They don't want to eat you. And the pythons that are here, I'd be more than happy to talk very python specific questions, but I want to make sure we sort of get to everything. And I got nowhere to be. I have to be at a meeting, which means I can be here as long as you need me to be, but I also want to be respectful of everybody's time because I know we said we were going till 3. But I'll stay here and answer as many questions as possible.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ranger Chris. That was a great answer. Mr. Trainer, I want to check in with you and see what your time limit is. We can stay for a little bit and answer questions depending on what you say.
We're good. You can go ahead and keep going. No problem.
And if you have a question and for some reason there's more questions than answers, Ranger Denise, can I ask you to please copy and paste the chat into an email? That way we can capture all of those in case we don't get to them now. And I promise we will answer all of them.
I'll be more than happy to, not a problem at all. So Eileen asked, the video referenced human encroachment in the Everglades. Is housing or commercial development prohibited in the national park?
Yes, inside of the boundary of the national park it is, but Everglades National Park only protects about 1/3 of the greater Everglades ecosystem. There's a bunch of different land management agencies that are constantly building, and they are encroaching closer and closer and closer to the boundary of the park. And what we're seeing is we're certainly seeing effects from that. So I don't want to say like, oh yeah, they're building right up to the Everglades. The movie referenced something called The Hole in the Donut, which is a wetland restoration project in which they restore habitat that used to be completely monoculture invasive species of Brazilian pepper. That's a wetland management project, mitigation project. So when people do decide to build in areas closer and closer west, so moving from east to west in the Everglades, if they're building on a wetland, they put that money into a wetland mitigation bank where they get credits. Those credits then pay to help restore projects in the Everglades. So yes, there is extensive building that's still going right up to the Everglades. And I've lived here for about 18 years, something like that. And it's pretty remarkable to see the incredible pace of growth that we're experiencing here in South Florida.
Thank you so much, Ranger Chris. So I want to make sure I try to get all answers. Okay. How did the Everglades get its name, and what does it mean?
Good, really great question. So if you recall the pictures of the Everglades, or where I was standing out there, glade is an old English word for a grassy field. Like, oh, let's go down to the glades or wherever. I tried an English accent. I'm so sorry. But when the first English speakers got here, they said that there were glades or grassy fields that went on forever. So Everglades. And it can mean whatever you want to hold in your heart. The Everglades means lots of things to lots of people, but in terms of the linguistic root of the word, that's where it was believed it came from.
Absolutely. And we Rangers do have a saying that no matter how much you love the Everglades will never love you back. And that can be because of during the wet season, the water's very high. We don't get a lot of visitors, and it's because we have a very prolific problem of mosquitoes. So, oh my goodness. I mean, Ranger Chris can attest to this. We walk through clouds of black sometimes, and it's really interesting, but it is an incredible glade that goes on forever and ever. So another question, when they built the cities around Everglades, did they fill in the land or dirt with cement or to make the land hard enough to build on, or did we build on top of something that was already hard?
What a great question. So in the very beginning, they certainly so when we talked about how very beginning, how different types of limestone was deposited. We could have talked Everglades geology for a whole hour. The highest part is known as the Atlantic Coastal Ridge. And that's the fringe of what is now the shoreline of Miami, Fort Lauderdale, all the way up to Palm Beach. It was an absolute mountain by Florida standards, maybe 18 feet high. So they built on that higher area, and that was dominated by hardwood hammock and the pine rocklands. In areas where they needed more ground. What you're looking at right behind me is a wonderful example. This is not a natural lake. There are very few natural lakes in this part of South Florida. This is what's called a borrow pit, in terms of they borrowed the limestone in order to facilitate roads and provide the base of buildings. And concrete is a huge use of both water and limestone. Most of the buildings in South Florida are locally sourced. Okay, because there's building material and water right underneath our feet. So the buildings, once Miami began to be developed in earnest, really dramatically, after about 1930, and then once air conditioning, started in the 1950s, it really started to explode. And they borrow land, which has that limestone, and they use it to fill it in. So many of the communities that you'll visit in South Florida will actually be surrounded by a lake. That lake is the limestone that was borrowed, much like this lake was right here, to build park roads and campgrounds behind me.
All right. So this question is near and dear to my heart. Is the Okefenokee Swamp the same from the Everglades or different? And Chris, if you don't mind, I'd love to take a stab at this. I actually started off my career in the federal service at Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge. And I was so astounded. I grew up here in South Florida, and I was so astounded at how similar they are. But they are two different ecosystems. Okefenokee is kind of on the cusp of the Florida-Georgia line, and the Everglades ecosystem, like we saw, is in central Florida all the way south. So even though they have similar cypress trees and different and similar habitats, it's actually very different. If you actually look at the soil composition, they have a lot more tannic acid, and we have a lot more calcium carbonate, that hard rock limestone that we see. Sorry, I got really excited when I saw that, Ranger Chris.
No, that's totally fine.
And then Wendy asked, what's the weather like in the Everglades?
Right now, well, I understand that this many folks might be from California, so I'm not even going to really brag about the weather. It's actually kind of overcast today. But right now it's about maybe 77 overcast. South Florida is if you're looking at a weather map, when you check the morning weather on your way out, and it's like, well, let's look at the weather all over the country. Like everything's purple. Even parts of California is purple and blue. And you get to the very tip of South Florida, we're like orange or red. For most of the year, it's going to be very pleasant during the dry season. We don't have a lot of rain. The humidity isn't as oppressive as it can be. So between December and April, it's really pretty comfortable with highs of about mid 70s, low 80s, and maybe lows in like maybe the 60s, maybe the 50s. And then during the summer months, it is the summer months is like the winter months up north. It is in that can be oppressive and unbearable. I think we went about 6 or 7 months where the temperatures never dip below 70 degrees, even at night. But it's going to be very, very humid. And during the rainy season, like clockwork, almost every day you have a lot of that heat. Gets to be at mid 90s. It's going to have a pretty substantial downpour every day at about 2 or 3 o'clock.
Ranger Chris, from Leslie Ann, she said, how have hurricanes historically affected the Everglades?
My sister's named Leslie Ann. I don't know if I've ever known another one out in the wild. What a treat. Hurricanes, much like fire, plays an important role in managing the ecosystem, and there are adaptations by plants and animals. The Everglades responds very well to hurricanes. It acts as a cleaning agent. It can, in the aquatic portions of the park, it can actually stir up a lot of the dead and decomposing matter that's underneath the water, which can actually allow other things to grow. It's the humans that suffer and our buildings that suffer the most. And one thing that we had, Hurricane Irma came by here in 2017, and it was a bad mamma jamma. And as it barreled through, it made my life really inconvenient, and everybody's life down here really inconvenient. And when we were looking at the park, there was this park that had this wonderful, big, tall, live oak tree that was hundreds of years old, and we're like, oh man, and it got knocked over. We're like, well, that's a bummer. But within a couple of weeks, there were a sprout from this. It's a papaya tree, and it's a native papaya, and it's grown up maybe 20 or 30 feet. And the park botanist was really interested about it. He's like, whoa, what was this? It turns out we do have native papayas, and those seeds were laying dormant underneath that tree for 80 to 90 years. And when that tree fell over because of a hurricane, it was the first chance for that plant to grow. So the environment knows what it's doing down here, and certain populations might suffer one way or the other, but it's humans that suffer most dramatically from the effects of hurricanes. And another example, I think when we were supposed to do this, I think it was Ranger Jeff who was supposed to do this in November. It got canceled because we had a hurricane in November. And that's why everything is so wet right now. It's a profoundly wet year, the wettest year that we've had, at least this time of year, since I've been here in South Florida.
Well, Ranger Chris, it looks like our chat is drying up. If anyone has any last minute chats, please feel free and put them in. But Ranger Chris, I did want to ask you, did you tell them the good news about students?
No, thank you for reminding me. So ordinarily, Ranger Jeff, the videographer, Ranger Denise, and I, we work for the Parks Education Department. And much like, I guess, the rest of planet Earth, at least humans, we've had to kind of pivot our programs. We don't have kids coming in and visiting the park. Ordinarily, we'd be taking them to all of these places. Not so fast, and maybe we wouldn't have talked so in depth about it. But the goal of what we try to do is to encourage students to come out to parks. And I understand that this isn't necessarily an audience of fifth graders or fourth graders, but if there is a fifth grader or fourth grader in your life, whether it's a child or grandchild, there is something called the Every Kid Outdoors program, in which you go online. We'll make sure, at least I'll send it to our contacts on here, a link to it where a fourth or fifth grader can go online, ask like a couple of simple questions, and then they get a pass where they can come out to any national park for free. Not just the Everglades, not just national parks, but every single federal land. That's millions and millions of acres. So for fourth or fifth graders to come out, and not just them, but an entire carload of children. So if you want to exploit your children or grandchildren who are in fourth or fifth grade, be sure to do that. And they can be a reason for all of you to come and carpool and visit a wonderful, the wonderful public lands, which belong to anybody that can hear my voice.
And it sounds like some of us may also have the Golden Pass, or now called the
right on.
Senior Pass.
That is for the sophisticated and well-traveled individuals. Absolutely. There, if you cross a certain threshold of age, I believe it's 62 years. I'd have to double check that. It's been a while since I did passes. You can qualify for a free pass to get into every federal land, and I'll include that link when we send it out, everything at the end.
Absolutely. Well,
Thank you for
Ranger
reminding
Chris,
me.
I think we are up on our time. Everyone is saying thank you in the chat. They really appreciate it.
Oh,
All the information.
thank you. This is what a treat. What a fun audience. You know, I think it's really, I Googled, I was like, what is this program all about? I think when I was younger, and I'm not old, but when I was younger, I thought I would hit an age and I would just sort of, I don't know, you turn like 35, you just kind of plateau. I think it's so awesome that everybody's out and learning. And I'm so humbled that you would think of using the Everglades as a place to learn. It's way better to visit. I thank you so much all for being here, for organizing this. What a fun, awesome way for us to spend an afternoon. If you have any more questions that come up, I'll make sure you can feel free to pass my email or contact info along. If you have any questions or want to come down and visit, we'll be happy to tell you more. But thank you so much for the wonderful, including us in your learning. What a treat. And thank you so much for spending your time with us.
Thank you so much, Ranger Chris. Everyone is saying thank you. You are both terrific representatives of the Everglades. What a well-rounded, fascinating program. Keep up the great work. Our oldest is 103 years old. Thanks for the great tour.
Right.
Oh my gosh.
That's awesome. Older, yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. And you've got our information. We barely stuck our toe into the Everglades. We didn't even talk about other habitats. Couldn't even get to it. Not enough time, but we have the rest of our lives to keep learning about this place. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much. And I'm actually looking up right now the Senior Pass link. You guys are more than welcome to drop off, but I want to throw that in here so you guys can see it. I'm pasting it right now in the chat for everyone to see. All right. Thank you all so much. I hope you saw it. And thank you guys so much. Thank you for joining us. I hope you learned a lot. And please contact us if you have any questions at all. Have a great day. Be safe.
Thank you very much, Denise.
Thank you, Mr. Trainer. Bye.
Well, that will conclude our session. I hope you all enjoyed it and wish you all a wonderful day and have a good one.